It was a chilly evening in the heart of Paris, and the streets were alive with the hum of life. The city's famous landmarks glowed under soft lights, while locals and tourists alike strolled past cafes and boutiques. Inside one of the most luxurious restaurants in the area, Le Ciel Étoilé, things were bustling as usual. The restaurant was known for its exquisite dishes, impeccable service, and an atmosphere so refined it felt like stepping into another world. The dining room sparkled with crystal chandeliers hanging high above polished wooden floors. Every table was adorned with pristine white linen, delicate china plates, and gleaming silverware. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, carrying trays loaded with gourmet meals that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Guests whispered in hushed tones, sipping fine wine and enjoying the kind of evening only money could buy. But then something happened that no one expected. A man walked in who didn't belong there. At least that's what everyone thought at first glance. His clothes were dirty and patched up, his hair unkempt, and his face weathered by time and hardship. He carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder, and his shoes were scuffed and worn. It was clear he hadn't bathed in days, and the faint smell of the streets clung to him. The hostess froze when she saw him standing awkwardly near the entrance. She glanced around nervously, unsure of what to do. A few diners turned their heads, curiosity mixing with discomfort. Some exchanged quick looks, silently questioning whether this was some kind of prank or mistake. Even the waitstaff paused mid-step, unsure if they should approach him or pretend not to notice. Just as the tension began to build, the head chef emerged from the kitchen. Jean-Luc Moreau was a towering figure with sharp features and an intense gaze that commanded respect. Known for his fiery temper and unmatched dedication to perfection, he ran the restaurant like a well-oiled machine. But tonight, instead of barking orders or inspecting dishes, he stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the stranger. For a moment, Jean-Luc just stared. There was something about the man's eyes, deep-set and tired but strangely familiar, that caught his attention. They weren't the eyes of someone who had always lived on the streets. They held stories, pain, and perhaps even wisdom earned through years of struggle. As Jean-Luc took a step closer, the man shifted uncomfortably, clutching his backpack tighter. "Can I help you?" Jean-Luc asked, his tone firm but not unkind. The man hesitated, clearly out of place among the elegance surrounding him. He started, his voice rough and barely audible. Then, after clearing his throat, he added, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come here." Jean-Luc frowned, his instincts telling him there was more to this situation than met the eye. "Wait," he said, raising a hand slightly to stop the man from leaving. "Do I know you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The stranger blinked slowly, as though weighing his options. Finally, he shook his head. "No," he replied softly. "At least I don't think so." Something about the way he spoke, the slight hesitation, the depth in his voice, made Jean-Luc's chest tighten. He couldn't explain it, but he felt certain this wasn't just any homeless man wandering off the street. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Ignoring the curious glances from staff and patrons, Jean-Luc gestured toward a quiet corner of the dining room. "Why don't you sit down for a moment?" he suggested, his tone softer now. "Let me get you some water." The man looked surprised, but nodded reluctantly. He shuffled over to a chair tucked away from the main crowd, sinking into it as though grateful for the chance to rest. Jean-Luc returned moments later with a glass of water, placing it gently on the table before sitting down across from him. "You look like you've been through a lot," Jean-Luc said, studying the man carefully. "What brings you here tonight?" The stranger stared at the glass of water for a long moment as if gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his words came out slow and deliberate. "I guess I needed to see this place one last time," he murmured. "It holds memories." That single sentence sent a shiver down Jean-Luc's spine. Memories. What kind of memories could this man possibly have tied to Le Ciel Étoilé? This restaurant was Jean-Luc's domain, his masterpiece, built on years of hard work and sacrifice. And yet, somehow, this broken figure sitting across from him seemed connected to it in ways he couldn't yet understand. "Tell me your name," Jean-Luc urged, leaning forward slightly. "Please." The man hesitated again, his fingers tracing the rim of the glass. For a moment it seemed like he might refuse to answer, but then quietly, almost reluctantly, he whispered, "Henri." The name hit Jean-Luc like a punch to the gut. Henri. Could it really be him? The legendary chef who had once mentored Jean-Luc, shaping him into the culinary master he was today. The same man who had vanished without a trace over a decade ago, leaving behind only whispers of scandal and tragedy? Jean-Luc sat back, stunned. He studied the man's face again, searching for traces of the confident, larger-than-life mentor he remembered. Though years of hardship had taken their toll, there was no mistaking those piercing blue eyes or the slight curve of his jawline. It was him. It had to be. "What are you doing here, Henri?" Jean-Luc asked, his voice cracking, with emotion. "Where have you been all these years?" Henri sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging under the weight of untold burdens. "That's a long story," he said, looking away. "One I'm not sure you'd want to hear." But Jean-Luc wasn't about to let him disappear again, not this time. Whatever had brought Henri to his doorstep tonight, whatever demons he was running from, Jean-Luc knew he had to find out, because deep down he still owed everything to this man and he wasn't ready to give up on him just yet. Jean-Luc's mind raced as he sat across from the man who called himself Henri. Memories flooded back, memories of a younger version of himself, standing in a bustling kitchen, watching this very man work his magic. Henri wasn't just a mentor. He was a legend. His name had once been synonymous with excellence in French cuisine. Young chefs dreamed of learning from him, and diners traveled from across the globe to taste his creations. But that was before everything fell apart. Henri looked up, meeting Jean-Luc's gaze for the first time since revealing his identity. There was a flicker of shame in his eyes, quickly masked by a forced smile. "You don't have to pretend you remember me," he said quietly. "I'm not the same person anymore." Jean-Luc shook his head firmly. "Don't say that," he replied, his voice filled with conviction. "Of course I remember you. You were more than just my teacher. You were like a father to me. After my parents passed away, it was you who showed me what it meant to live, with passion, to take pride in my craft. Do you think I could ever forget that?" Henri's face softened, though sadness lingered in his expression. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. "People change, or maybe they don't, and the world just moves on without them." Jean-Luc leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He wanted answers, not just for himself, but for the man sitting across from him. This wasn't the confident, larger-than-life figure he remembered. This Henri seemed broken, weighed down by years of pain and regret. What had happened to bring him to this point? "Tell me your story," Jean-Luc urged gently. "Whatever it is, I want to hear it." Henri hesitated, staring at the glass of water between his hands. For a moment it seemed like he might refuse, but then, with a deep breath, he began to speak. His words came slowly at first, as if each sentence carried the weight of years unspoken. "I used to believe I was untouchable," he admitted, his voice tinged with bitterness. "When things were good, they were really good. I had fame, money, respect, everything I thought mattered. People would line up outside my restaurants just to get a reservation. Critics praised me, other chefs envied me, even strangers on the street recognized me. It felt like nothing could stop me." He paused, swallowing hard. "But success makes you reckless. At least it did for me. I started taking risks, not in the kitchen, where I always stayed true to my craft, but in other parts of my life. Investments, partnerships, loans. I convinced myself I knew better than everyone else. And when those decisions started going south, I doubled down instead of cutting my losses." Jean-Luc listened intently, his heart sinking as the pieces began to fall into place. He'd heard rumors about Henri's downfall years ago. Whispers. of financial ruin and failed ventures, but hearing it from the man himself made it painfully real. It all unraveled so fast, Henri continued, his voice trembling now. One bad decision led to another, and before I knew it, I was drowning in debt. My restaurants closed one by one. Investors turned their backs on me. Friends stopped calling, even my family. He trailed off, shaking his head. They couldn't understand why I hadn't asked for help sooner. But how do you admit you've lost everything? How do you face people who once looked up to you knowing you let them down? The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant clinking of silverware and murmured conversations from the dining room. Jean-Luc didn't know what to say. The man before him was a shadow of the mentor he idolized, yet the pain in his voice was raw and unmistakably human. And then, Jean-Luc prompted softly, encouraging him to go on. Henri sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Then I ran. I couldn't bear to stay in a city where everyone knew me, or thought they did. So I left. No note, no explanation. Just disappeared. At first I told myself it was temporary. I'd regroup, start over somewhere new. But the harder I tried to fix things, the worse they got. Eventually I ended up here. Here meant the streets. Jean-Luc's chest tightened at the thought of Henri sleeping rough, battling hunger and loneliness day after day. It was almost unimaginable. The man who had once commanded kitchens with authority and grace reduced to surviving on scraps and scraps of dignity. Why didn't you reach out to anyone? Jean-Luc asked, his tone gentle but probing. You must have known there were people who cared about you, people who would have helped. Henri chuckled bitterly, the sound hollow. Pride, he said simply. Stubbornness. Fear. Take your pick. I convinced myself I deserved what happened, that it was punishment for being reckless, arrogant, selfish. And honestly, part of me didn't want anyone to see me like this, especially not you. His last words hung in the air, sharp and poignant. Jean-Luc felt a lump rise in his throat. Why me? He asked finally. What does it matter what I think? Henri looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, Jean-Luc saw a glimmer of the man he used to be. Because you were my greatest success, Henri said, his voice thick with emotion. You were the son I never had, the one person I truly believed in. Seeing you achieve everything you have, it reminded me of what I lost, and I couldn't face that. The admission hit Jean-Luc like a wave. All these years he'd assumed Henri had abandoned him, leaving him to navigate the culinary world alone. But the truth was far more complicated and far more heartbreaking. Henri hadn't walked away because he didn't care. He'd done it because he cared too much. I'm sorry, Henri added, his voice barely above a whisper. For everything. Jean-Luc reached across the table, placing a hand on Henri's arm. Don't apologize, he said firmly. Not to me. Not tonight. We can figure out the rest later. Right now you're here. That's what matters. For the first time since walking into the restaurant, Henri smiled. A small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was enough to remind Jean-Luc of the man he once knew, brilliant, passionate, and full of potential. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Jean-Luc was determined to help Henri reclaim even a fraction of the life he'd lost. As they sat together in the quiet corner of the opulent dining room, surrounded by luxury that felt worlds away from Henri's reality, Jean-Luc made a silent promise. He wouldn't let his mentor fade into obscurity again. Somehow, some way, he would give Henri the chance to rise once more. Not as the legend he used to be, but as the man he still was beneath the scars of time and hardship. The next morning, the restaurant was quiet. The hustle and bustle of the previous night had faded, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost sacred. Jean-Luc arrived early, his mind racing with thoughts about Henri. He knew he couldn't just leave him out on the streets again, not after everything he'd heard. But helping someone rebuild their life wasn't as simple as offering a meal or a bed for the night. It required patience, understanding, and most importantly, trust. Henri was already awake when Jean-Luc stepped into the small staff lounge where he'd let him stay temporarily. The older man sat on a worn-out couch, staring at the floor with a distant look in his eyes. His hands were clasped tightly together as if trying to hold on to something intangible. When Jean-Luc entered, Henri glanced up briefly before looking away again, clearly uncomfortable. "Good morning," Jean-Luc said softly, breaking the silence. "Did you sleep okay?" Henri shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Better than usual," he mumbled. "Thanks for letting me crash here." Jean-Luc nodded, pulling up a chair across from him. "Listen," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about how hard it's been for you to ask for help. I get it, I really do. Pride can be both a gift and a curse, but right now I need you to trust me. Just a little bit." Henri frowned, his brow furrowing. "Trust you to do what?" he asked warily. "To give you a chance," Jean-Luc replied, firmly. "Not charity, not pity. A real chance to start over. And I think the best place to begin is where you're strongest. In the kitchen." For a moment, Henri didn't respond. His gaze flickered toward the door leading to the main kitchen, where the faint sound of prep work could already be heard. Then he shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "Look at me, Jean-Luc. I'm not the same person I used to be. My hands shake. My mind isn't sharp anymore. I'm lucky if I can even boil water without burning it these days." Jean-Luc leaned forward, his expression unwavering. "That's not true," he insisted. "You may have lost confidence, but your skills, those don't just disappear. They're part of who you are. You taught me that cooking isn't just about recipes. It's about heart, passion, and memory. Those things don't fade no matter how much time passes." Henri looked away, his jaw tightening. He wanted to believe Jean-Luc, but doubt clouded his thoughts. After years of living on the margins, it was hard to imagine stepping back into a world that felt so foreign now. Still, there was something in Jean-Luc's voice, something steady and sincere, that gave him pause. "What exactly are you proposing?" Henri asked finally, his tone cautious. Jean-Luc smiled faintly, sensing a crack in the wall Henri had built around himself. "Come spend some time in the kitchen with us," he suggested. "No pressure, no expectations. Just observe, maybe lend a hand if you feel up to it. Let yourself remember what it feels like to create something beautiful again. Who knows, maybe it'll spark something." Henri hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. The idea of returning to the kitchen, the one place where he'd always felt truly alive, was both terrifying and tantalizing. Could he really step back into that world after everything that had happened? Or would he only embarrass himself, proving once and for all that he was nothing more than a washed-up has-been? "I don't know," he murmured, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. Jean-Luc stood up, extending a hand toward him. "You don't have to decide right now," he said reassuringly. "But I promise you this. Whatever happens, I'll be here every step of the way. You won't face it alone." After a long pause, Henri reached out and took Jean-Luc's hand, gripping it weakly but with a hint of determination. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's see where this goes." Later that day, Henri found himself standing awkwardly near the prep station in the bustling kitchen. The energy was electric. Chefs moved with precision, chopping vegetables, searing meats, and plating dishes with artistic flair. The aroma of fresh herbs, simmering sauces, and baking bread filled the air, stirring memories Henri thought he'd buried long ago. At first, he kept his distance, watching silently as the team worked. Jean-Luc introduced him briefly to the staff, explaining simply that Henri was a mentor who had shaped his career. Some of the younger chefs exchanged curious glances, while others nodded respectfully, sensing the weight of the moment. No one questioned why a homeless man was suddenly standing in their midst. They trusted Jean-Luc implicitly and followed his lead. As the hours passed, Henri began to relax. He started by helping with small tasks, peeling potatoes, washing greens, organizing ingredients. Each movement felt clumsy at first, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted to the rhythm of the kitchen. But slowly, muscle memory kicked in. By the end of the day, he was chopping onions with surprising speed and accuracy, his knife slicing through the vegetable with practiced ease. Jean-Luc watched from afar, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't pushed Henri to take on anything too challenging, knowing that rebuilding confidence would take time. But seeing the spark return to his mentor's eyes was reward enough. By the third day, Henri ventured further out of his comfort zone. Jean-Luc handed him a recipe card for coq au vin, a classic dish Henri had perfected decades ago, and encouraged him to try recreating it. At first, Henri hesitated, unsure if he could live up to the standard he'd set for himself years earlier. But as he worked, something remarkable happened. The flavors came flooding back, as vivid as if they'd been waiting patiently all along. When the dish was ready, Jean-Luc plated it and brought it to a nearby table, inviting Henri to join him for a taste test. As they dug in, Jean-Luc closed, his eyes savoring the rich, complex flavors that danced on his tongue. When he opened them again, tears glistened in his eyes. "This," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "This is exactly how I remember it. Perfect." Henri stared at the plate, stunned. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel proud. The doubts and fears that had haunted him for so long began to loosen their grip, replaced by a flicker of hope. "You did this," Jean-Luc added, turning to Henri with a grin. "Not me. You." Henri shook his head, overwhelmed by the compliment. "It's not perfect," he protested weakly. "Not like it used to be." "It doesn't have to be," Jean-Luc countered. "Perfection isn't the goal. Connection is. And this dish, it connects us. To our past, to each other, to the love of food that brought us here in the first place." Henri didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the kitchen, taking in the sights and sounds of a world he thought he'd lost forever. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, even if it was just for a moment. As the days turned into weeks, Henri continued to find his footing. With each passing day, his confidence grew, and so did his bond with the team. They welcomed him warmly, treating him not as a relic of the past but as a valued member of their family. Slowly but surely, Henri began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond redemption after all. And Jean-Luc? He couldn't have been prouder. Watching his mentor rediscover his passion reminded him of why he fell in love with cooking in the first place. It wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about creating something meaningful, something that brought people together. And in that sense, Henri's journey was just beginning. As the weeks went by, Henri's presence in the kitchen became less of a novelty and more of a natural part of the rhythm at Le Ciel Étoilé. The staff grew accustomed to seeing him move quietly between stations, offering advice or lending a hand where needed. At first, some of the younger chefs were hesitant, unsure how to interact with someone who had once been a towering figure in the culinary world, but now seemed so humble and reserved. But Henri's quiet demeanor and genuine willingness to help soon won them over. He wasn't flashy about it. There were no grand speeches or dramatic demonstrations. Instead, he worked patiently, guiding apprentices through techniques they struggled with or suggesting subtle tweaks to elevate a dish. His knowledge wasn't just technical, it was deeply intuitive, born from years of experience and an almost spiritual connection to food. He could glance at a simmering sauce and know instinctively whether it needed more seasoning or a touch of acidity. He could taste a soup and pinpoint exactly which herb would balance its flavors perfectly. Jean-Luc watched all of this unfold with a mixture of pride and awe. It was as if Henri was slowly shedding the weight of his past failures and rediscovering the joy that had once defined him. Yet despite his progress in the kitchen, there was still a lingering hesitation, a reluctance to step fully back into the spotlight. Jean-Luc understood why. After years of living on the fringes, Henri feared judgment. He worried that people wouldn't see the man he was becoming, but only the broken shell he'd been when he walked into the restaurant that fateful night. One evening, After the dinner rush had died down and the kitchen crew was cleaning up, Jean-Luc approached Henri. They stood near the prep counter, surrounded by the comforting chaos of post-service cleanup, pots clanging, water running, laughter echoing faintly in the background. "I've been thinking," Jean-Luc said, wiping his hands on a towel, "we should do something special." Henri raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Something special?" he repeated. "Like what?" Jean-Luc grinned, leaning against the counter. "A tribute dinner. An event dedicated to mentorship and legacy. We'll invite critics, industry peers, old friends, anyone who matters, and you'll be the guest of honor." Henri froze, his expression shifting from curiosity to outright panic. "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "Absolutely not. I can't. I won't." "Why not?" Jean-Luc interrupted gently but firmly. "You're ready, Henri. You've proven that to yourself and to everyone here. This isn't about putting you on display or making you relive your glory days. It's about celebrating what you've given to this craft, and to me personally. People need to hear your story. They need to see that even after falling, you can rise again." Henri looked away, his jaw clenched tightly. "It's too soon," he muttered. I'm not that person anymore." "You don't have to be," Jean-Luc replied, his voice softening. "This isn't about being perfect or untouchable. It's about showing others that resilience is possible, that failure doesn't define us, it shapes us. And if anyone can inspire people to believe in second chances, it's you." For a long moment, Henri didn't respond. He stared at the floor, his mind racing. The thought of standing in front of a room full of people, many of whom had known him during his heyday, was terrifying. What would they think of him now? Would they pity him, judge him, or worse, dismiss him entirely? But then another thought crept in. What if Jean-Luc was right? What if sharing his story could help someone else who was struggling? Someone who felt like they'd hit rock bottom and couldn't climb back up? Maybe this wasn't just about him reclaiming his place in the culinary world. Maybe it was about giving hope to others who needed it. Finally, he sighed deeply, meeting Jean-Luc's gaze. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "you'll have to promise me one thing." "Anything," Jean-Luc replied without hesitation. "That you'll stand beside me," Henri said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The whole time." Jean-Luc nodded, a small smile spreading across his face. "Of course. Always." The night of the tribute dinner arrived faster than either of them expected. The restaurant was transformed for the occasion, with elegant, floral arrangements adorning each table and soft candlelight, casting a warm glow throughout the dining room. Every seat was filled and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Guests included renowned chefs, influential critics, and old colleagues of Henri's, whom Jean-Luc had gone out of his way to track down. Before the meal began, Jean-Luc stepped to the center of the room, tapping a spoon lightly against his glass to get everyone's attention. The chatter faded, and all eyes turned to him. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," he began, his voice steady and clear. "This evening is about celebrating mentorship, the kind of guidance that shapes careers, changes lives, and leaves a lasting impact. For me, there's one person who embodies that spirit more than anyone else. His name is Henri Dupont." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Jean-Luc gestured toward the corner of the room, where Henri stood nervously, clutching a glass of water. When their eyes met, Jean-Luc gave him an encouraging nod. "Henri taught me everything I know," Jean-Luc continued. "Not just how to cook, but how to live with passion and purpose. He showed me that food has the power to connect us, to tell stories, evoke emotions, and bring people together. But life hasn't always been kind to him. 10 years ago, he disappeared from the culinary scene, leaving behind questions and rumors. Many assumed he was gone for good." Jean-Luc paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he added, "What most people don't realize is that sometimes the greatest lessons come from struggle. Henri faced challenges that would have broken anyone else. Yet here he is tonight, standing tall and reminding us all that resilience is possible, that redemption isn't just a dream, it's a choice. By the time Jean-Luc finished speaking, the room was silent except for the sound of sniffles and muffled sobs. Several guests wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the raw honesty of his words. Slowly, applause began to build, starting with a few scattered claps and growing into a thunderous ovation. Henri took a shaky step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't planned to say anything. He hadn't trusted himself to speak. But now, looking out at the sea of faces before him, he knew he couldn't stay silent. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling but audible. "Thank you for welcoming me back. Not because I deserve it, but because you chose to. I won't pretend that the last decade has been easy. It hasn't. There were nights when I wondered if I'd ever find my way again. Nights when I doubted myself and questioned whether I had any value left to offer." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But then I walked into this restaurant, and Jean-Luc reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that we're defined not by our lowest moments, but by how we rise from them. So tonight isn't just about me. It's about every person in this room and beyond who has ever stumbled, fallen, or lost their way. If my story can give even one of you hope, then maybe all those hard years were worth it." When Henri finished speaking, the applause erupted again, louder and more heartfelt than before. Some guests stood, cheering, while others simply sat, in stunned silence, visibly moved by his words. For the first time in years, Henri felt truly seen, not as a failure or a relic of the past, but as a human being capable of growth, resilience, and grace. As the evening unfolded, the menu featured dishes inspired by Henri's legacy, prepared with care by Jean-Luc and the team. Each plate was accompanied by a brief explanation of its origins, tying it back to moments in Henri's career that had shaped his philosophy of cooking. The coq au vin made a triumphant return, earning rave reviews from diners who marveled at its depth and complexity. By the end of the night, Henri was exhausted but exhilarated. As he stood near the entrance, bidding farewell to departing guests, he noticed something remarkable. People weren't just thanking him for the meal. They were thanking him for his courage. Strangers shared their own stories of struggle and survival, telling him how his journey had inspired them to keep going when things felt hopeless. Jean-Luc joined him near the door, watching as the final guests left. "How are you holding up?" he asked, placing a supportive hand on Henri's shoulder. Henri smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Better than I have in a long time," he admitted. "I never imagined I'd feel this way again, like I'm part of something bigger than myself." Jean-Luc nodded, squeezing his shoulder gently. "That's because you are, and this is just the beginning." As the two men stood side by side, bathed in the soft glow of the restaurant's lights, they both knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. But for the first time in years, Henri allowed himself to believe that he wasn't walking it alone. In the weeks that followed the tribute dinner, Henri's life began to change in ways he never could have predicted. The event had opened doors he thought were closed forever, not just professionally but personally as well. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of a community again, a network of people who cared about him and believed in his potential. It wasn't just Jean-Luc or the staff at Le Ciel Étoilé anymore. It was an entire circle of friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had been touched by his story. One of the biggest shifts came when one of the restaurant's regular patrons, a wealthy businessman with a passion for fine dining, offered to help Henri get back on his feet financially. The man, whose name was Charles, had attended the tribute dinner and been deeply moved by Henri's speech. Afterward, he approached Jean-Luc privately and expressed his desire to assist in any way possible. Together, they arranged for Henri to move into a modest apartment near the restaurant. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, safe, and filled with sunlight, a far cry from the cramped shelters and cold streets where he'd spent so many nights. For Henri, having a place of his own again was both exhilarating and overwhelming. On the day he moved in, Jean-Luc accompanied him, carrying boxes of donated clothes and kitchen supplies. As they unpacked, Henri wandered through the small space, running his fingers along the edges of the furniture and peering out the window at the bustling street below. It feels strange, he admitted, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Being here, having walls around me again. Jean-Luc nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It'll take some getting used to, he said gently. But you deserve this, Henri. You've earned it. Henri smiled faintly, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. I don't know if I've earned anything, he replied. But I'm grateful, more than you can imagine. As the days turned into months, Henri settled into his new routine. He continued working closely with Jean-Luc and the team at the restaurant, mentoring young chefs and contributing to the menu. But beyond the kitchen, he also started exploring other aspects of his life that he'd neglected during his years on the streets. With Jean-Luc's encouragement, he reconnected with old friends and family members, many of whom had assumed he was gone for good. Reaching out to his estranged sister was one of the hardest things Henri had ever done. Their relationship had been strained long before his disappearance, and he feared she would reject him outright. But when he finally mustered the courage to call her, she answered with tears in her eyes, telling him how much she'd missed him and how relieved she was to hear his voice. They met for coffee a few days later, and though their conversation was awkward at times, it marked the beginning of a fragile but hopeful reconciliation. Henri also began attending therapy sessions, something Jean-Luc had suggested early on. At first, he resisted the idea, convinced that talking about his struggles wouldn't make them disappear. But after a few sessions, he realized how much weight he'd been carrying alone all those years. Opening up to someone, a trained professional who didn't judge him, helped him process the pain and guilt he'd buried deep inside. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was progress, and for Henri that was enough. Meanwhile, word of Henri's return to the culinary world spread quickly. Food critics wrote glowing articles about his influence on modern French cuisine, highlighting not only his technical brilliance, but also his resilience and humanity. Young chefs flocked to Le Ciel, Étoilé, eager to learn from the legendary figure whose name had once been synonymous with excellence. Henri welcomed them warmly, sharing not just his knowledge but also the lessons he'd learned about humility, failure, and redemption. Despite his growing visibility, Henri remained grounded. He refused to let himself be defined solely by his past achievements or his failures. Instead, he focused on the present moment, the joy of teaching, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful, and the simple pleasure of waking up each morning with purpose. One afternoon, as Henri stood in the kitchen preparing a batch of ratatouille, Jean-Luc joined him, leaning against the counter with a thoughtful expression. You know, Jean-Luc said, watching Henri work, you're inspiring people in ways you probably don't even realize. Henri chuckled softly, stirring the pot with practiced ease. I'm just doing what I love, he replied. If it inspires someone, that's great, but I'm not trying to be anyone's hero. That's exactly why you are, Jean-Luc countered with a grin. You're not putting on a show or chasing fame, you're being real. And that's rare these days. Henri paused, considering the comment. Then he shrugged, turning his attention back to the stove. Maybe, he said simply. But I think the real heroes are the ones who keep going when everything tells them to stop. People like you. Jean-Luc laughed, shaking his head. Don't give me too much credit. I wouldn't be half the chef I am without you. They shared a quiet moment of mutual respect, the kind that comes from years of shared history and unwavering support. In that moment, neither man needed to say anything more. They both understood the depth of what they'd been through together, and how far they'd come. Outside the restaurant, Henri's impact rippled outward in unexpected ways. One evening, as he walked home from work, he noticed a young man huddled on a bench near the park. His clothes were ragged, and his face was hidden behind a tattered scarf. Something about the scene struck a chord deep within Henri, reminding him of his own darkest days. Instead of walking past, Henri stopped and sat down beside the man. Mind if I join you? He asked quietly. The young man looked up, startled but wary. Sure, he muttered, shifting slightly to make room. Henri introduced himself, keeping his tone casual and non-threatening. They talked for nearly an hour, exchanging stories and sharing bits of their lives. By the end of the conversation, the young man seemed less guarded, more willing to open up. Before leaving, Henri handed him a card with his phone number written on it. "If you ever need anything," he said sincerely, "don't hesitate to call. Sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you that you're not alone." The young man nodded, clutching the card tightly. "Thanks," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I mean it." As Henri walked away, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. Helping others wasn't about erasing his own past. It was about using it to make a difference. And in doing so, he found a renewed sense of purpose. By the time winter arrived, Henri's transformation was undeniable. He was no longer the broken, defeated man who had walked into Le Ciel Étoilé months earlier. He was stronger, wiser, and more at peace with himself. The scars of his journey remained, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he'd come and how much he still had to offer. One chilly evening, as snowflakes began to fall outside the restaurant's windows, Jean-Luc pulled Henri aside after service. The kitchen was quiet now, the chaos of the night replaced by a calm stillness. "I've been thinking," Jean-Luc said, handing Henri a steaming cup of tea. "We should start offering cooking classes to the public, not just fancy techniques or high-end dishes, but practical skills anyone can use. Things like how to stretch ingredients, cook on a budget, or make something delicious out of leftovers." Henri raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's a great idea," he said. "But why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to lead them," Jean-Luc replied matter-of-factly. "Who better to teach people the value of resourcefulness and creativity than someone who's lived it? Plus, it'll give you a chance to connect with people outside the restaurant." Henri hesitated, surprised by the suggestion. Teaching a formal class was different from mentoring apprentices in the kitchen. It required structure, preparation, and a certain level of confidence he wasn't sure he possessed yet. But as he thought about it, he realized it could be another step forward, a way to share his passion with a wider audience while continuing to heal. "I'll do it," he said finally, a small smile spreading across his face. "On one condition." "What's that?" Jean-Luc asked, grinning. "That you help me plan the curriculum," Henri replied. "After all, teamwork makes the dream work, right?" Jean-Luc laughed, clapping him on the back. "Deal." As they stood together in the warmth of the kitchen, surrounded by the comforting scents of herbs and spices, both men knew they were embarking on a new chapter, not just for themselves, but for everyone whose lives they touched. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and for Henri, every step of the way was worth savoring. Months turned into a year, and life for Henri settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The cooking classes he and Jean-Luc had dreamed up became a reality, drawing crowds of eager participants from all walks of life. Some were young, professionals looking to impress their friends with gourmet meals. Others were parents trying to stretch tight budgets without sacrificing flavor. But many came because they'd heard about Henri's story, how he'd risen from the depths of despair to find purpose again. And they wanted to learn not just from his skills, but from his resilience. The classes were held in the restaurant's private dining room, which doubled as a cozy teaching space. On the first day, Henri stood nervously at the front of the room, gripping a wooden spoon like a lifeline. He glanced at Jean-Luc, who gave him an encouraging nod before slipping out to handle kitchen duties. Taking a deep breath, Henri addressed the group. "Welcome," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I'm glad you're here. Cooking is one of the most universal things we do. It connects us to our families, our cultures, and even ourselves. Today I want to teach you how to make something simple but meaningful, a hearty vegetable stew." As he guided them through the process, Henri couldn't help but notice the way people leaned forward, hanging on his every word. They weren't just learning how to chop onions or simmer broth, they were absorbing pieces of his philosophy. When someone asked why he insisted on tasting every ingredient before adding it to the pot, he smiled and said, "Because food tells a story. Every bite should remind you of where you are, who you're with, and what matters most. By the end of the session, the room buzzed with laughter and chatter as attendees sampled their creations. One woman approached Henri shyly, holding out her bowl. "This is amazing," she said, her eyes shining. "I never thought I could cook something this good." Henri chuckled softly. "You did all the work," he replied. "I just showed you the way." She shook her head. "It's more than that. You made me believe I could do it, thank you." Moments like these filled Henri with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. Teaching wasn't just about passing on knowledge. It was about empowering others to see their own potential. And in doing so, he found himself growing. Stronger, too. Outside the restaurant, Henri's influence continued to spread. His story inspired articles, podcasts, and even a short documentary filmed by a local journalist. The piece highlighted not only his culinary achievements but also his journey of redemption, a testament to the idea that no one is beyond saving if given a chance. Viewers flooded social media with messages of gratitude, sharing their own struggles, and expressing hope that they too could rebuild their lives. One message stood out to Henri in particular. It came from a man who identified himself only as a former chef. He wrote, "Your story saved me. I lost everything, my career, my family, my dignity, and I didn't think I'd ever recover. Seeing how you turned your life around gave me the courage to try again. Thank you." Henri read the note over and over, tears welling in his eyes. For so long he'd believed his failures rendered him useless, unworthy of anyone's time or attention. But now, he saw the truth. His scars weren't liabilities, they were tools. Tools he could use to help others heal. On a quiet evening several months later, Henri found himself back in the restaurant's kitchen, preparing a meal alongside Jean-Luc. The two men worked side by side, their movements synchronized after years of collaboration. Tonight, however, was special. They weren't cooking for patrons or staff, they were making dinner for themselves. "What are we having?" Henri asked, peering into the pot bubbling on the stove. "Something simple," Jean-Luc replied with a grin. "Coq au vin, just like old times." Henri laughed, shaking his head. "You know, I never thought I'd taste this dish again without feeling like a fraud." Jean-Luc stopped stirring and turned to look at him. "Why would you feel like a fraud? You created this recipe. You perfected it." "Because I stopped believing I deserved to call myself a chef," Henri admitted quietly. "For years I convinced myself I'd lost the right to stand in a kitchen, that I'd let everyone down, including you." Jean-Luc set down his spoon and placed a hand on Henri's shoulder. "Let me tell you something," he said firmly. "Being a chef isn't about titles or accolades. It's about passion, creativity, and heart. Those things don't disappear when life gets hard. They might get buried, sure, but they're always there, waiting for you to dig them up again. And you did. You dug them up and shared them with the world." Henri nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "I guess I needed to hear that," he murmured. "Well, consider it said," Jean-Luc replied with a smile. "Now finish chopping those mushrooms before they rot." They laughed together, the sound filling the kitchen like music. As they worked, Henri reflected on how far they'd come, not just individually, but as a team. Their bond had grown stronger, through adversity forged in the fires of struggle and triumph. Together they had built something beautiful, not just a restaurant, but a legacy rooted in compassion and resilience. That night, as they sat down to enjoy the meal they'd prepared, Henri raised his glass in a silent toast. Jean-Luc followed suit, clinking his glass against Henri's. "To second chances," Jean-Luc said simply. "And to the people who give them," Henri added, meeting his friend's gaze. They ate in comfortable silence, savoring the rich flavors of the coq au vin. Each bite carried memories of lessons learned, battles fought, and victories earned. For Henri, it was a reminder that life wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about finding meaning in the aftermath. Redemption wasn't a single moment. It was a series of choices, each one leading closer to wholeness. As the evening drew to a close, Henri stepped outside to take in the cool night air. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, coating the city in a soft blanket of white. He pulled, his coat tighter around him, and gazed up at the stars, feeling a profound sense of peace. He thought about the young man he'd met on the park bench months ago, the one clutching his card like a lifeline. Just last week, the man had called to say he'd landed a job at a local cafe. "Thanks to you," he'd said. "You reminded me I still have value." Henri smiled to himself, knowing that his journey wasn't just about personal redemption. It was about creating ripples, small acts of kindness and encouragement that spread outward, touching lives in ways he might never fully understand. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Jean-Luc joined him on the sidewalk. "Cold enough for you?" he joked, rubbing his hands together. "It's perfect," Henri replied, exhaling a cloud of warm breath into the frosty air. "Everything feels right." Jean-Luc nodded, following his gaze toward the glittering horizon. "Yeah," he agreed. "It does." And for the first time in years, Henri truly believed it. Life hadn't erased his pain or rewritten his past, but it had given him something equally precious, the chance to start anew. Not as the legend he once was, but as the man he'd become, a man shaped by hardship, fueled by hope, and driven by love. In the distance, church bells chimed midnight, signaling the start of a new day. Henri took a deep breath, letting the sound wash over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. With friends like Jean-Luc by his side, and a community that believed in him, the road ahead seemed less daunting and infinitely brighter. As snowflakes settled gently on his shoulders, Henri whispered a quiet promise to himself. "This time I'll keep moving forward,